Just one more thing. You mentioned the two submarines. What's the role of nuclear weapons?
Well, I would like for America to have an extremely minimal nuclear deterrent and work toward a world free of nuclear weapons. And I know that that sounds utopian. However, I would remind your audience that Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev came within a hair of achieving a deal just like that at Reykjavik, Iceland in 1986. And they were both of them dead serious about it, complete and total nuclear disarmament. And then Reagan was essentially bullied by Richard Pearl and others on his staff, saying, you promised the American people that you would build them a defensive anti-missile system, the Star Wars system, which was total pie in the sky technological fantasy of the 1980s. And if you're getting rid of all the ICBMs, then why the hell do you need a missile shield anyway? Is the world's probably greatest tragedy that ever took place that Ronald Reagan walked away from those negotiations. They literally were within a hair. And it wasn't magic, and there was no trust in evil bad guys. This is, by the way, 2 years before the wall came down. This is when everybody still thought the USSR was going to last. And Reagan had, the plan was that America and the Soviet Union would dismantle our nuclear weapons until we were right around with parity with the other nuclear weapon states who all have right around 200 or 300 nukes. France, Britain, at that time, Israel and China. India and Pakistan came later. South Africa only had a few then, but gave up whatever they had. And the idea was we would get down to 200 or 300. And then America and the Soviet Union both together would lean hard on Britain, France, and China. Let's all get down to 100. Let's all see if we can get down to 50, etc., like that in stages. Again, Ronald Reagan we're talking about here. Trust but verify means do not trust at all. It means be polite while you verify. And in fact, America did help dismantle upwards of 60-something thousand Soviet nuclear missiles after the end of the Cold War. And so it is possible to live in a world where at the very least we have a situation where the major powers have a few nukes and potentially can even come to an arrangement to get rid of the rest.
We should also just say one more thing, not to be ageist, but most of the major leaders with nukes and those with power in the world are in their 70s and 80s. I don't know if that contributes to it, but they kind of are grounded in a different time. That maybe I have a hope for the fresher, younger leaders to have a more optimistic view towards peace and to be able to reach towards peace.
Mm-hmm. And underlying so much of what we're talking about here is all this enmity, right? But if America could just work, remember when China cut that pseudo sort of peace deal between Saudi and Iran a couple years ago, or last year, was it? Well, we could try to double up on that. We could try to come up with ways for Saudi and Iran to exchange as much as possible. You know, I know you don't like all the going back too far in history, but it's important. It's in my book that in 1993, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who the revolution had happened on his watch, Operation Eagle Claw, the disaster of the rescue mission in 79 after the hostage crisis and everything, all that egg was on ZB's face. But in 93, he said we should normalize relations. We should build an oil pipeline across Iran so they can make money, we can make money, and we can start to normalize. And Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, who had been Kissinger's right-hand man, agreed. They both were trying to push that. But the Clinton administration went ahead with Martin Indyk, who had been Yitzhak Shamir's man, and inaugurated the dual containment policy instead, because the Israelis were concerned that America had just beaten up on Iraq so bad in Iraq War I that now Iraq wasn't powerful enough to balance against Iran. So America had to stay in Saudi to balance against them both. And that was the origin of the dual containment policy. It was Martin Indyk, who had been Yitzhak Shamir's man, who pushed it on Clinton. And this was not the Israelis. It was the Kuwaitis who lied that there was a truck bomb attempt assassination against H.W. Bush, which was a total hoax. It was debunked by Seymour Hersh by the end of the year. It was just a whiskey smuggling ring. And it was the same guy whose daughter had claimed to have seen the Iraqi soldiers throw the babies out of the incubators. He was the guy who 2 years later made up this hoax about Saddam Hussein trying to murder Bush Sr. But when he did, that was when Bill Clinton finally gave in and adopted the dual containment policy, because he had been interested in potentially reaching out to Saddam and the Ayatollah both at that time. But instead of having normalization with both, we had to have permanent Cold War through the end of the century with both. And my argument is simply, it just didn't have to be that way. It's the same thing with Russia. Look at how determined the Democrats especially are to have this conflict with Russia. Where to Donald Trump, nah, not at all. We could get along with them. And so it's perfectly within reason. If Zbigniew Brzezinski says we can talk with Iran and get along with Iran, and Donald Trump says we can get along with Russia, then the same thing for North Korea, the same thing for China. And then who do we have left to fight? Hezbollah? Hezbollah's nothing without Iran.
But just have Scott and I fighting. That'll be the last remaining
that's
two.
the fun kind of fight.
That'll be fun fight.
Mark,
peaceful.
You're the CEO of FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. It's a DC-based organization that focuses on national security and foreign policy. What has been your approach to solving some of these problems of the world?
So, look, I love the vision that Scott painted. And I agree with some of the libertarian instincts that he has. But my view is that America is the indispensable power. Scott mentioned earlier in the conversation about the rules-based order that is so important, and the NPT and all these rules-based agreements that are important to maintain. Well, the rules-based order has been maintained by the United States since World War II, right? There is no American prosperity to the degree that we have. There's no recovery of Europe. There's no recovery of Asia after the devastation of World War II without American power and the rules-based order that America has led and backstopped. And I think America First is about American power and deterrence. I think if you want to avoid war, I think you cannot just believe in some fantasy where all the world's leaders are going to get together in some place and are just going to agree to disarm all their nuclear weapons, and we'll disarm our entire military and we'll have one submarine off our coast. And some of all of that is going to lead to peace. I mean, I think what has led to peace in the past has been the American forward deterrence of our military and a belief that our enemies think we will credibly use it. I think if they believe we'll credibly use it, then it's less likely they will challenge us. And if they're less likely to challenge us and challenge our allies, there's less likely to be war. So for me, deterrence leads to peace. And any kind of unilateral disarmament, any kind of, I think, sort of fanciful notion that somehow our enemies are going to respect the non-aggression principle that is the core fundamental underpinnings of libertarianism, which I think in a personal relationship, I think is very important. But remember, these are aggressors. They don't respect the non-aggression principle. I think we can spend a lot of time, we did over how many hours now has it been, talking about the fact that in Scott's view of the world, it's America that provokes. It's America that provokes. Oh, and then it's not America provoking, it's Israel provoking. And oh, by the way, America provokes because we're being seduced or paid or browbeaten by those Israelis and, those Jews in America. I mean, I think that whole notion that somehow we are the provocative force in global politics, I think is wrong. I think the fact of the matter is, we make mistakes. We are an imperfect nation. We have made some serious, sometimes catastrophic mistakes. But there is a bad world out there. There are evil men who want to do us harm, and we have to prevent them from doing us harm. And to do that, we need an American military that is serious and well supported. We don't need a military-industrial complex that ultimately is going to pull us into wars. We need thoughtful leaders like President Trump who will resist that and will say at the end of the day, I will use force when it is selective, narrow, overwhelming, and deadly. And that was Trump's operation just a few days ago. He went after 3 key facilities that were being used to develop the capability for nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are the greatest danger to humanity. I totally agree with Scott. Like, I think a world without nuclear weapons, the kind of world that Reagan envisioned and others have envisioned since, is really the only way we can eliminate the most devastating weapons that could end humankind. But we have to make sure that those weapons don't end up in the hands of regimes that seek to do us harm, and that have done us harm over many, many decades. So yeah, I mean, deterrence, peace through strength, rules-based order. The foundation for defense of democracies is not the foundation for promotion of democracy. We don't believe in this important concept that we have to promote democracy around the world. I'll speak for myself because we have many people in my think tank. We're 105 people. We have different views. I don't personally believe that it is the role of the United States to bring democracy to the Middle East or democracy around the world. I think to the extent we've tried, we've failed. I'm not sure the Middle East is ready for democracy. Now, Iran is interesting because it's not an Arab country, right? It is a different country altogether culturally. It's a very sophisticated country. It has a long history. It actually has a history where it has had democracy in the past. It is a country that I think could have incredible potential under the right leadership and under the right circumstances. I don't know if the right circumstances are a constitutional monarchy with Reza Pahlavi as the crown prince or the Shah. I don't know whether it's a secular democracy or not. Let Iranians make that decision.
Have I been pronouncing it wrong this whole time?
Reza Pahlavi?
You know the guy?
I met him, yeah. Yeah.
Pahlavi.
What were you saying?
I thought it was Pahlavi.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Right?
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Heartbreaking.
The only thing you've ever gotten wrong is
Exactly.
pronouncing a Pablo
So
wrong.
far.
That's not bad. That's not bad.
Pronouncing so many things correctly.
Yeah.
I think people will give you a pass.
Can I ask you though? I mean, all this militarization has led to a state of permanent war. We've been bombing Iraq for 30, 40 years. We put a war against the Taliban, who didn't attack us, instead of Al Qaeda, who did. Fought for 20 years, and the Taliban won anyway. We launched an aggressive war against Saddam Hussein, put the Ayatollah's best friends in power. We launched an aggressive war against Libya on this ridiculous hoax that Gaddafi was about to murder every last man, woman, and child in Benghazi. Imagine Charlotte, North Carolina being wiped off the map. Barack Obama lied in order to start that war and completely destroyed Libya. It's now 3 pieces in a state of semi-permanent civil war, including, and this wasn't just back then, this is to this day, the re-legalization and re-institutionalization of chattel slavery of sub-Saharan Black Africans in Libya to this day as a result. Our intervention, this was not a direct overt war, but America, Israel, Saudi, Qatar, and Turkey all backed the bin Ladenites in Syria, completely destroyed Syria to the point where the caliphate grew up. And then we had to launch Iraq War III to destroy the caliphate again. And so I'm not seeing the peace through strength. I'm seeing permanent militarism and permanent war through strength.
Point well made. He's speaking to the double-edged sword of a strong military. That what you mentioned that Trump did seems like a very difficult thing to do, which is keep it hit hard and keep it short.
We don't know how this ended yet.
But even the beginning part is not trivial to do. Like just hitting one mission and vocalizing, except for one post, no regime change, like really pushing peace, make a deal, ceasefire. Like that's an uncommon way to operate. So I guess you said that we should resist the military-industrial complex. That's not easy to do. That's the double-edged sword of a strong military.
Yemen. Let me say real quick, and I promise I'll shut.
I'm
going to say one thing, and then I'll stop.
You made your point.
I just want to add, it's a really important point, okay, is grassroots effort. There is no Houthi lobby in America, okay? It was grassroots efforts by libertarians, Quakers, and leftists to get war powers resolutions introduced in Trump's first term to stop the war in Yemen, which was launched not for Israel, for Saudi Arabia and UAE by Barack Obama in 2015. It's not a first. The Afghan war wasn't about Israel either. Okay, but this Yemen war was...
I thought 9/11 was about Israel.
Well, it was in great part, but the decision to sack Kabul and do a regime change and all that had nothing to do with the Likud whatsoever, other than, well, we got to keep the war going long enough to go to Baghdad.
Oh, okay. So it was Israel's fault.
I was in the middle of saying about the war in Yemen that we got the war powers resolution through twice, and Trump vetoed it twice. And his man, Pete Navarro, explained to the New York Times that this was just welfare for American industry. A lot of industrialists were angry about the tariffs disrupting trade with China, and somehow they substituted Raytheon for all American industry somehow and said industry will be happy if we funnel a lot of money to Raytheon. That's Pete Navarro talking to the New York Times about why they continued the war in Yemen throughout Trump's entire first term. He had no interest in it at all. The whole thing was it was Obama's fault. The whole thing was essentially on autopilot. And what was he doing? He's flying as Al-Qaeda's Air Force against the Houthis, who originally, if you go back to January of 2015, America was passing intelligence to the Houthis to use to kill Al-Qaeda. You know, AQAP, the guys that tried to blow up the plane over Detroit with the underpants bomb on Christmas Day 2009, that did all those horrific massacres in Europe, real-ass bin Ladenite terrorists. The Houthis were our allies against them before Barack Obama stabbed them in the back. And why did Trump keep that going when he inherited that horrific war from Barack Obama? Why'd he do it? According to his trade guy, so that they could keep funneling American taxed and inflated dollars into the pocketbooks of stockholders of Raytheon Incorporated.
Right. Military-industrial complex. The point was made.
Yeah, maybe I could respond to that. Because, I mean, again, it's always America's fault, according to Scott.
Let's take a jab at it.
No, but it's
Saudi and UAE asked Barack Obama for permission to start that war and for American help in prosecuting it, and he said yes,
okay.
and helped them
I'm going to segue into an answer, because I think it deserves an answer. A military-industrial complex is a serious concern, because I think you're right. The bigger it gets, and the more weapons you have, you think the greater the temptation to use it, right? I think that's sort of the argument. And then there's also self-enrichment and how much money can be made. And all of that, I think, is of serious concern to people. Look, I think Trump is somebody who, it's hard pressed to say that Donald Trump is a great advocate of the military-industrial complex, or that he is in their pocket. The same way that he's in the pocket of the Israelis and in the pocket of the Saudis and in the pocket of everybody. I mean, I think the one thing with Trump is that he has learned the lessons of American engagement over the past few decades. And I think Scott's done a good job of kind of laying out the mistakes that have been made, even though, we can discuss about causal connections and who's responsible. And, I lean on...
Can we? I want to.
Well, Scott, can I finish? Because, your causal connection is always, it's America aggressing, Israel aggressing, and all these poor people responding to us. But nonetheless, I think Trump he's learned the lessons, but he hasn't overlearned the lessons. He's not paralyzed by Iraq or Afghanistan or the mistakes made by his predecessors. He understands that at the end of the day, we need serious American power. We need lethal power. We need forward deterrence. And he's been very careful and very selective about how he uses American power. I mean, we've talked about it throughout this whole conversation. Trump used American power to kill Qasem Soleimani, one of the world's most dangerous terrorists. He killed Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, one of the world's most dangerous terrorists. He refrained from going after the Iranian takedown of our drone. He refrained from when the Iranians fired on Saudi Aramco and took off 20% of our oil, right? He's been very, very selective about the use of American power. He did go after the Houthis, who are Iran-backed, and were using Iranian missiles to go after our ships.
That's not true. Those are North Korean missiles, completely debunked by Jane's Defense Weekly. Right. Nice try.
Yeah, nice try. Anyway, everybody knows that the Iranians have been financing the Houthis. Hezbollah has been training the Houthis, and Iran has given capabilities to the Houthis to develop their own indigenous missile capability. The fact of the matter is, he did, in a way, go after the Houthis much more intensively than Biden did in order to prevent them from continuing to shut down Red Sea shipping, on which both America and our allies depend as a trade route. He actually did it quite successfully because after a few days of pretty intensive bombing, the Houthis got the message and they cut a deal with Donald Trump. They're not going to interfere with our ships anymore.
He cut a deal with them. They kept bombing Israel, which is what got him involved in the first place. He completely backed out. Sounds to me like they won and he backed down.
Well, it sounds like he, in terms of promoting American national security interests, it sounds like he did a pretty good job of sending a message to the Houthis and the Iranians. Don't mess with the United States. And that gets us to the contemporary reality. He took a decision on one day, to send our B2s and our subs in order to do severe damage to 3 nuclear facilities. It was a one-day campaign. It was selective. It was narrow. It was overwhelming. And I think it sends a message to Khamenei. I think it sends a message to regimes around the world, anti-American regimes around the world, that Donald Trump has not overlearned the lessons of the past 20 years, right? But that in fact, he is not going to dismantle the U.S. military and dismantle our nuclear program and fly around to all these cities and call peace conferences and hope that these dictators will just sit down with America and say, you know what? All is forgiven, the United States of America. It's all your fault. You did this all. We admit our responsibility, and then we have peace and paradise on earth. I think Trump is much more pragmatic and, in some respects, cynical when he looks at the world and he realizes the world is a dangerous place. I have to be very careful about how I use American military forces. I am not going to send hundreds of thousands of people around the world. By the way, I mean, you all talk about Israel. I mean, the Israelis are one of the best allies we could possibly have. They fight and they die in their own defense. They fought multiple wars against American enemies. They haven't asked for American troops on the ground. There are no boots on the ground in Israel defending Israel. The best we've given them is we've given them a THAAD system to help them shoot down ballistic missiles that are aimed at them. And our American pilots have been in the air recently with our Israeli friends shooting down ballistic missiles. But the Israelis have had a warrior ethos. We will fight and we will die in our own defense. I would just say, if you're going to actually build out a model where you're going to minimize the risk to American troops, let's find more allies like that, right? I'm like Scott, I really worry about China, Taiwan. I really, really worry about that because the Taiwanese are not capable of defending themselves without U.S. assistance. And we may have to send American men and women to go defend Taiwan, and we can have a whole debate about the wisdom of that. But again, it would be very, very helpful to have more Israels in the world, more countries that are capable of fighting against common enemies and against common threats without having to always put American boots on the ground in order to do that.
So you made a case for, if it's okay, if you made a case for strength here, just practically speaking, why do you think Trump has talked about peace a lot? Why do you think he hasn't been able to get to a ceasefire with Ukraine and Russia, for example? If we just move away from Iran, without getting into the history of the whole thing, like why he's been talking peace. He's been pushing it and pushing it. What can we learn about that so far failure that's also instructive for Iran?
Look, I'm not a Russia expert. I'm not a Ukraine expert. I'm sitting in front of two people who know a lot more about that conflict than I do.
You are, we should say, banned by Putin.
I am. I have been sanctioned by Russia and by Iran.
Yeah. Sanctioned, yes.
Yes, banned, sanctioned, threatened.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Well, it causes some difficulties, but anyway, I think the answer to that is that for Putin, he needs to understand that, like Khamenei, he has two options here, right? Option one, which President Trump has signaled over and over and over again is come sit down and negotiate a ceasefire with the Ukrainians. Okay. I don't want to get into the details and the back and forth about who's responsible for the fact there's no ceasefire, Putin or Zelensky. I mean, that's a whole other debate, and I'm sure you guys have a lot of opinions on that. But path one is sit down and let's negotiate a ceasefire. Path two is the United States will use American power in order to build our leverage so that Vladimir Putin understands that he has to do a ceasefire. Now, I'm not suggesting U.S. troops. Absolutely not. Right? What I am suggesting is there's a package right now of sanctions that have 88 co-sponsors in the Senate across party lines. And I think Trump is using that and will use that as a sort of sword of Damocles hanging over Putin and the Russian economy to say, look, Vladimir, we either do a ceasefire or I'm going to have no choice but to have to start imposing much more punishing sanctions on you and on the Russian economy. So I think there's an economic option. I think there's a military option. And I think the biggest mistake Biden made in this whole war, and there's many mistakes in terms of signaling, not having U.S. credibility, Afghan debacle, which signaled to Putin that he could invade without any kind of American response, is he kind of went in and he tied Ukraine's hands behind their back. I mean, he actually tied one hand behind their back while they were fighting with the other hand. And he refused to give him the kinds of systems that early on in the war would have allowed the Ukrainian military to be able to hit Russian forces that were mobilizing on the Russian-Ukrainian border. And I think if he had done that, I think this war would have ended sooner. There'd be far less casualties. And I think Putin would then understand, maybe I need to strike a deal. I'm not a Russia expert or a Ukraine expert. I don't know what the deal looks like. You keep the Donbass, you keep Crimea, you keep, larger chunks of eastern Ukraine. That's for smarter people than me on this issue to decide what the deal looks like. But there's no doubt today, Putin thinks that he can just keep fighting, keep killing Ukrainians, keep driving forward. Eventually, he's going to wear down the Ukrainians through a sheer war of attrition. He'll throw hundreds of thousands of Russians at this. He doesn't care how many Russians are going to die. That's the way the Russians and the Soviets have fought wars for many, many years. Just endless number of Russian bodies being thrown into the meat grinder. And he thinks he can continue without any consequences. And I worry that as a result of the fact that we are not showing Putin that we've got leverage, it's made war more likely. It's made a war more brutal, and it's going to make a war more protracted.
But increasing military aid to Ukraine, in the case that you described, also has to be coupled with extreme pressure to make peace.
Correct. Extreme pressure to make peace.
Which Trump hopefully appears to be doing now in Iran.
I think Trump is early. I mean, it's interesting you said that because he's early indicators. Again, who knows where the ceasefire goes? But I think it was important. He slapped Khamenei, but he also said to Bibi, enough. And it's like, okay, now we're going back to Oman. There's going to be a temporary ceasefire. Now let's negotiate. And I think that's important. And I think it shows that Donald Trump is leading, not following. It shows that Donald Trump is his own man, not on the payroll of the Russians or the Iranians or the Israelis or all these other crazy accusations that have been made about this guy for many, many years. And he's going to give, as they say, peace a chance. And he's going to give a ceasefire a chance. He's going to give negotiations a chance. But I don't think he's sending the message to the Iranians, and he needs to send it to Putin, is if you don't take me up on my offer, right, I've already demonstrated that I am serious, and I will use American power carefully and selectively in the way that I've done in the past.
At the risk of doing the thing I shouldn't do. But just to test the ideas of libertarianism and the things we've been talking about, can we, for a brief time, unrelated to everything we've been talking about, talk about World War II? What was the right thing to do in 1938, 1939? Like, what would you do?